everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Andrew Wilson, Deputy Secretary General and Global Policy Director at the ICC. Andrew, thanks so much for coming back on.
Pleasure to be with you again.
Andrew, you and I have a conversation every couple of weeks regarding tariffs, and I think you're a really good gauge of where exactly we are when it comes to global trade talks. Tariff tensions are simmering once again. The 90-day pause on President Trump's reciprocal tariffs was supposed to be lifted earlier in July, but it has been extended to August 1st. And President Trump has been in the process of sending countries tariff rates in the form of letters, and we will get into some of those details in just a bit here. But to start off the conversation, what do you make of the tariff moment we're in right now?
Well, that is very much, I think, the question companies across the world are now grappling with. My own view, and I'm sure there are many people who disagree with this, but my own view is I think the TACO logic that has, I think, been widely accepted by the financial markets, the idea that the president threatens tariffs and then always backs down, is wildly overplayed. And I say that because I think what we've seen in the last week or so is a very clear indication that this US administration wants to see higher tariffs. It's not going to accept, meaningless deals just to bring the tariff rates down. And I think what we're seeing now is almost a game of seeing what will the markets accept in terms of the highest possible effective tariff rate. We've seen the president talk about maybe increasing the baseline rate from 10% to 15% or maybe even 20%. And I think this is part of a broad and in some ways pretty dangerous strategy to see how high can you push that level. So I think the markets are pretty sanguine. They seem to be expecting the administration to back down in some way, shape, or form. But I think from a real economy perspective, we have to accept that this is an administration that wants to see higher tariffs. And the only question now is, how high will that rate be?
I think that's a really good question. But first, I want to get to your Taco Trump point. Taco standing for Trump always chickens out. Forbes has a tracker of from Liberation Day, which was at the beginning of April, to now of how many times the president has flip-flopped when it comes to tariffs, and it's over 24 times. He said August 1st, that's pretty much the drop-dead date. There's no more extensions. He's not kicking the can down the road. Do you think it would be wise then for the rest of the world to believe him now?
I think he has to be taken seriously. I mean, there has been the flip-flopping on various announcements, not just on trade. That certainly makes the administration very unpredictable. But I think the signal is absolutely clear. This administration believes in tariffs as a policy tool for a number of different reasons. Clearly, the game afoot is to see how high that rate can be pushed in terms of the effective overall level. And I think this really has to light a fire under other governments to come to the table as quickly as possible and to see what can be secured in terms of bilateral deals. So those negotiations will not be easy. I think we've had some signals in the last few hours from Indonesia that a deal seems to have been done. I suspect others will follow. But I think in some ways we're entering the end game, whether it's August 1st or September the 1st, as some people have suggested, where we'll start to see a bottoming out of what the tariff environment is going to look like in terms of the baseline tariff, the reciprocal tariffs on different countries, and then the product-specific or sector-specific tariffs that the administration has been gradually rolling out. So it's that cocktail of measures that I think will probably start to crystallize as we go through Q3 into Q4.
How high then do you think is too high when it comes to these tariff rates? Because President Trump over the weekend announced that he is slapping 30% tariffs on both the EU and Mexico. And these are some of the United States' biggest trading partners. They are entities that have been involved in negotiations with the United States. What do you make of that rate?
I think anything above a 10% rate starts to become very risky from an economic perspective. And I think if you look just at this from the perspective of consumer prices in the US, net operating margins in most supply chains are between 5 and 15%. There are some outliers where there are bigger margins, but most sit within that rate if you look at the available data. Anything above 10% seems to imply, from our perspective, an inevitable degree of pass through in terms of prices that businesses are charged and prices that end consumers are charged. So I think if we're going to a level of an effective tariff rate, now I think we're at around 16%, with some of the letters that have been sent out, plus the sectoral measures, probably the rate ends up closer to 20% or maybe a little bit above that. So I think there are inherent risks in terms of cost of living pressures for US consumers if that rate goes above 10%. And if in some areas it goes way, way beyond that. I mean, obviously, European Union and Mexico are great examples. We've had Brazil threatened with a 50% tariff on top of other prevailing tariffs, which would mean the effective rate would be around 70%. So I think from a US consumer perspective, there are inherent risks. Now, of course, that won't show up immediately because companies have been smart. They've stockpiled inventory since the end of last year. But I think there are already some signs, if you dissect the inflation data from the US government, that perishable goods, bananas, for instance, are already seeing price increases pretty significantly above the headline figures. So I think there is really a big, big risk in terms of what may happen in terms of US inflation. And I think obviously the US government is very, very mindful of the financial markets, and it's good that they've responded to signals in terms of the equity markets and also the market for US treasuries. But I think not only the Federal Reserve, but the administration writ large need to be mindful of the potential risks of stoking consumer inflation at a time when US consumers are very understandably cost conscious.
Who do you think then the biggest loser is here in all of these trade negotiations? Do you think it is the US consumer who is going to eventually, as you said, not this second, but eventually feel the squeeze of these tariffs? Is it the consumer around the world? What really does that look like?
I think, frankly, no one wins from a tariff escalation, right? Um, and I know that's, it sounds like a pretty staid soundbite, and people have been warning about the risks of tariffs now for several months, and maybe it all seems hyperbolic, but I think the evidence is pretty clear. Tariffs are a very, very significant drag on growth. And where you end up with retaliation, tit for tat measures, there is ultimately a huge downward pressure on economic activity across the world. So I think at one level, yes, this is a huge potential tax increase on US consumers. And the pass through cost, this is not free money for the US Treasury that will be paid for by foreign suppliers. There will be inevitable pass through, just simply because of the margins in most supply chains. I think more broadly, though, this is not a healthy environment for global trade or the global economy. So I think if the US does move, for whatever reason, towards a very, very high effective tariff rate, let's say above 20%, which would be the biggest we've seen since the early 1900s, then it's going to have global consequences for many, many businesses. And there will be sectors that have high dependencies on the US market, automobiles, steel, aluminium, etc., that will be acutely affected. So I think what we're looking at is a very uncertain, a very risky outlook globally. But I think it's difficult to see how the US consumer wins from a tariff escalation. It is ultimately a tax on goods, one way or another.
And it seemed like when news of the EU 30% tariff rate came out this weekend, there was a lot of surprise. That seemed like people weren't expecting that rate to be so high, and there seemed to be a lot of anger. And the EU's trade commissioner said that, quote, trading as we know it will not continue, with huge negative effects on both sides of the Atlantic. And the European Council said that the bilateral trade between the EU and the United States last year alone was almost $2 trillion. So, what are the impacts here, both economically and on our trading relationship with the EU?
So I think we have to hope that the 30% that has been outlined in the president's letter is a negotiating tactic, that this is all part of the art of the deal applied to trade policy making, and that it will be a starting point for concerted negotiations to get a deal. 30%, I think you're looking at essentially two potential scenarios. It will vary sector by sector, product by product, but either really significant cost pass through or simply trade dislocation. If you can't pass the costs through the supply chain on to consumers, then some of that trade is ultimately going to stop, as we've seen with the dislocation of US-China trade in the second quarter of this year. So I think there is an immediate risk. Clearly, some sectors in Europe will be particularly acutely affected: automobiles, steel, potentially pharmaceuticals, particularly depending on what happens with sectoral tariffs that have been trailed by the administration. I think more broadly, this has been historically the world's deepest trade relationship. If you take the totality of the European Union and the US, it's one that's been underpinned by and large by shared values, a shared belief in rules-based commerce and the power of open markets. And these are the two blocks, if you like, that crafted the global trading system that we have today. So a fracturing of that system at one level is economically damaging and will be particularly acutely damaging, I think, in a number of areas of EU manufacturing. But it also comes at a symbolic cost. And that's why I say we really, truly hope in the business community there can be an effort to forge a deal, get the tariffs down to the lowest possible effective rate, and also find a way to reset, realign on the future of international trade cooperation. And together with the right outlook, and it requires political will from both sides, the EU and US together could be an immensely powerful force in terms of reshaping, rebalancing, resetting the global trading system.
I mean, with these tariffs, President Trump has really essentially taken a sledgehammer to global trade as we know it, with these tough negotiations, with making these announcements on social media, really throwing back, I believe, the global trade community on its heels. I mean, you and I have talked before about the art of the deal. I'm going to ask you again. I know I asked you a few months ago, but do you think President Trump's art of the deal, what is that going to do with global trade talks and our relationships in the long term?
So I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think the deal ultimately being sought is to test how high the tariff rate can go without the markets freaking out or without stoking inflation, right? So at one level, it's good that the administration is sensitive to what the market thinks and how consumers, how voters ultimately react. But I think that is where we're ultimately headed. The administration seems to view this as a source of free money. If you look at some of the writings of Stephen Myron, for instance, and obviously there's a push to reshore manufacturing, bring back jobs to the United States. And believe me when I say I am very, very, very sensitive to that argument, the hollowing out of US manufacturing, etc. I think the question I have is, are tariffs the right way to do that? Can US manufacturing, or can the US economy be rebalanced overnight? Is the risk of applying tariffs ultimately too high? Is the risk reward balance right ultimately? So I think there are a number of downside risks as to whether the US administration can achieve what very understandably it wants to do. The one thing I would say about this administration that is positive is, well, two things. One, the president has been very clear what he was going to do all along, right? No one should have been taken by surprise at the speed at which he's acted and the way he's pursued higher tariffs based on what he said on the campaign trail. He detailed it very, very clearly for several months. So I think there is, some credit due to him and his administration there. The second thing is, we shouldn't pretend that the global trading system was all fine and dandy at the start of 2025. There are some inherent issues in the system. The US is certainly right to be concerned about Chinese industrial policy, as are many other nations. There is a legitimate argument that global trade rules have been ineffective or are in many ways outdated. So the president really shaking up the system in the way he has, in his own unique style, in some ways is positive. Yes, there's a risk to the US economy. Yes, there's a risk to the global economy. Yes, it's not diplomacy as usual. But this was a system in need of some shaking up, in need of some resetting. And really our hope is that it will jolt countries like the UK, like the European Union, into reflecting about what the future of global trade cooperation looks like and how that can be achieved. And that can't be achieved simply with bilateral deals to reduce US tariffs. There needs to be fundamental rethinking about what the global trade architecture looks like.
And I think that the next date that we really have our eye out on is August 1st. And I know that you said in these letters, the rates that President Trump set, you think that those are a negotiating tactic to get the countries to come to the table faster. We are 2 weeks out from that August 1st deadline. What signposts are you looking out for next?
So I think there's a fundamental question as to whether August 1st will be the drop dead date. I think September the 1st has already been indicated. It could move again, but I think we're entering the end game, right? So to me, the question is, first of all, does this really push countries to seriously pursue a negotiated deal with the US? And I think there are signs, Europe, for instance, that it probably has done. The threat of the 30% tariff, the sense that the US isn't going to back down and accept just any deal. So I think we'll, steadily see more countries concluding deals or coming closer to, and probably an intensification of the negotiations. That said, it's pretty implausible that within, whether it's 2 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, that the US can do 30, 40, 50 comprehensive trade deals. So there will be some residual reciprocal tariffs out there without any shadow of a doubt if the US administration follows through. I think the big downside risk right now is, or the two countries to watch for are Brazil and then the European Union. Brazil is already contemplating retaliation and has put out there, I think, by way of a legislative act in the last 48 hours or so, an indication that they're ready to increase tariffs on imports from the US, which are pretty significant in a number of sectors, including pharmaceuticals, but also they're willing to consider violating the intellectual property rights of US companies. So an intensification there. There are still pressures acutely aware in Brussels that the European Union should retaliate or invoke anti-coercion measures, as I think President Macron has indicated in the last few days. So I think if we end up with retaliation rather than deals, then we could be entering a new phase of this that would be decisively messy in terms of US tariffs going on, countries retaliating with tariffs or restrictive measures of their own. And then we know from recent experience, the US has a tendency to escalate. So we really do need to avoid that. And hopefully, as I say, this really does now fire the starting gun for a concerted effort to get as many deals in place or close to being in place as possible.
I feel like, Andrew, I always end our conversations the same way, saying there's certainly a lot to look out for when it comes to these tariffs. And that remains true in this conversation. So, as we continue to get more developments on these tariff negotiations, I hope you come back on and join me. Andrew Wilson, thank you so much for the time.
With pleasure. Thank you, Brittany.